Just honestly, we've got ambitions to be bigger than DYDX by the end of the year.
Wow.
But it would still be less than 1% of all global volume, right? Which is insane when you think about it. So centralized entities still just, and you come back to the whole CDFI point, centralized entities still just dominate volume, which is for a whole bunch of reasons, right? And what we're deliberately doing by having the C part of CDFI is that it provides a path through which we can genuinely start competing with them, right? And actually bring all of that volume on chain.
Welcome to Steady Lads. In this episode today, I have Simon, the CEO and co-founder of Reya. Reya is a specialty blockchain purpose-built for trading, perps, etc. Think of things like Osmosis or DYDX. They aim to compete with centralized exchanges like Binance and Coinbase, and they want to beat them in things like speed or things like fees or user interface, so that users are like, hey, it's actually easier to use Reya than it is to use things like Binance and Coinbase. Currently, Binance and Coinbase and all these centralized exchanges, they dominate the game when it comes to derivatives. But Reya sees a future where Reya dominates the game when it comes to derivatives, and those centralized exchanges can go kick rocks. Reya is unique in a lot of ways, but specifically in that it's one of the first projects I know of building specifically for Polygon's new aggregator layer. An ecosystem, Polygon's ecosystem, where moving between chains takes literally seconds and is completely abstracted away. That's supposed to come out by the end of this year, and Reya is building specifically for that kind of ecosystem, meaning that Reya has the potential to build up more liquidity than any protocol ever has before in history, because it could become essentially the central liquidity sink for not just one chain, not just two chains, not just hundreds of chains, but potentially thousands or tens of thousands of chains in the future, which means we might be possibly witnessing the birth of a new kind of crypto project built for essentially crypto's version of the internet. Can you start off by just introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Simon. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of Reya Labs.
Awesome. Very... That's a very brief explanation of yourself.
You want my background?
No, I liked it. Can you briefly explain what is Reya?
Yeah, sure. So Reya's what I'm describing as a new breed of CDFI exchange, where we deliberately combine the best of kind of what's possible off-chain with the best of what's possible on-chain in order to provide maximum value through to users. So to explain that, for example, we have a super high-performant order book, so it kind of enables super low latency, high throughput trading. But then the big difference versus a centralized exchange, as an example, is that then kind of propagates for the execution and settlement of those trades to take place on our own trading optimized network, which is called Reya Network. So the combination of these two things is kind of what we describe as CDFI. What's kind of interesting is, to begin with, the way in which this will work is, I kind of often describe it as it will kind of feel like a vertically integrated exchange. So someone interacting with Reya to begin with will feel as if they're just interacting with one thing, where they have this very kind of high throughput, low latency trading experience, but then ultimately these trades are settling on chain, so they have the benefits of transparency, self-custodial ownership, and then the composability that exists off the back of that. But the reason I'm describing it as a vertically integrated exchange to begin with is one of the things that's really cool that we'll do in the medium term is we'll start expanding horizontally. And what I mean by that is other exchanges can come in and they can start building on top of Reya Network. And because a lot of the financial logic that supports trading is actually embedded into the network itself, what's really cool is at the point that starts happening, the network starts operating like a clearinghouse, which is super cool. And essentially what that means, so if you don't know what a clearinghouse does, just at the most abstract level, that improves the capital efficiency for everybody trading on one of those exchanges. So for example, if you're running an exchange and I were to go long ETH on your exchange, but I then to come to Reya exchange and go short ETH, in a normal world, these two exchanges can't talk to each other. So I've got two margin kind of requirements on each exchange. In this new world, with Reya Network supporting those exchanges, actually the network is able to recognize that those two positions offset each other. So instead of having two margin requirements, actually, if you're trading the same notional, it will reduce your margin requirement to 0, which is super cool.
Okay, I feel like there's a lot to break down there, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. So I might ask some questions that seem kind of dumb to you, but I imagine if I don't understand it, there's a lot of other people that don't too. So it'll be helpful for that. So you said C DeFi. Can you explain that concept a little bit more? You don't mean like CeFi, like from back in the day where we had Celsius, we had kind of these things. This is something different you're describing. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it's kind of, so we're, just for what it's worth, we're a DeFi team, right? This is actually, it's the same team that built Volt's protocol, if you're familiar with that. It's the world's first interest rate swap exchange. We grew that actually to kind of over 30 billion in volume within about 12 months. We sunset that to focus on Reya because Reya is just like 1,000 times bigger idea. But the reason I'm kind of giving that context is we're fundamentally a DeFi team that has recognized that in order to provide maximum value to users, there actually are some layers which need to exist on top of DeFi rails in order to provide that super high throughput, low latency trading experience. Right? Like there's one example of multiple things we can do with a centralized exchange, but it is a centralized exchange that operates on top of the network, right, in order to provide maximum value to users. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Can you maybe go into some of the risk factors or like transparency issues? Like when you look at something like Celsius, right, the issue with something like that was that behind the scenes, you didn't really know what was happening with all the funds that users were depositing. If you look at something like FTX, which obviously is fully centralized, behind the scenes, you didn't know what was happening with user funds. And so can you explain maybe what components are decentralized, which ones are centralized, and kind of how those mesh together as far as like risks and all that?
Yeah, so maybe if I just take a little bit of a step back. So if we talk about it from like an architectural perspective in terms of the product that has been built, there's essentially like two core components. There's Reya network, which is what we're describing as a trading optimized network. So it is fundamentally an L2. It leverages the Polygon CDK. We can kind of talk about that. The key thing which is different with this is that a lot of the financial logic that is used to support trading is built into the network itself, right? Which is just fundamentally different. So it's very application specific in terms of the design. Separate to that, what we also have is we have a very high performant, kind of low latency order book that exists off chain. Because we're never going to be able to achieve comparable levels of kind of speed and throughput to the likes of Binance, so we can ultimately start displacing kind of these kind of centralized entities which dominate the industry. Right? We're never going to be able to achieve that if we try and build the order book on chain. Right? So we deliberately have kept that off chain, right? And that's kind of like the C DeFi part. And what that order book does is essentially it facilitates the matching of orders. Right, so it doesn't deal with the execution, it doesn't deal with the clearing, it doesn't deal with the settlement. All of that takes place on chain. And what it's essentially doing at that point is it's enabling kind of makers and takers to be matched against each other at certain price points. Right? And then when they are matched, that then propagates kind of that match trade on chain, at which point it actually properly executes, right? And then is ultimately in the future kind of cleared and settled.
Okay. I'll do my best to kind of summarize and explain how I think it works, and you tell me if I'm wrong on any level. So basically, you have Reya, the L2, which is this custom-built L2 specifically for trading. This is a place for, think of like DYDX, think of things like that. Like this is a very purpose-built layer 2 for trading. It has a ton of things that can go with it. You mentioned a bunch of other people can come build on it and build different products, and they all kind of work together, and it's amazing. On top of that, you built this more centralized product, which is essentially the order book aspect of this exchange process that you're putting together. And you've built that more centralized for speed and low latency, so you could be competitive and similar to something like Binance and centralized exchanges. So it's like there's really no difference between using something like Binance or this product you've built because you have this centralized aspect, which just has to do with the matching of orders, but has nothing to do with the settlement, and you're not holding users' funds, nothing like that.
That's exactly right, yeah. So it enables us, effectively therefore enables us to compete on those dimensions with Binance, but users get all the benefits associated with fundamentally, effectively being a DeFi protocol.
And so when it comes to Reya and the chain itself, you talked about it a little bit, but it maybe go into some of the like factors that make it unique versus a generalized L2 like optimism or arbitrum.
Yeah. So I think it's actually one of the most interesting things is even if I just kind of talk about it more generally, like what does the future look like, right? Like it's become a little bit of a meme for kind of Ethereum recently, but there's going to be thousands of L2s. Just honestly, I think there's going to be absolutely thousands of L2s. And to begin with, everybody's going to think that's a little bit weird because it's just like, well, why has everybody got their own chain? And also, you appear to lose one of the main benefits associated with DeFi, which is composability, because everyone's suddenly on their own chains. But then we're going to get all of the interoperability that will start to exist, so you get the composability coming back. And then you start to realize, well, actually, like if I've got my own chain, why am I kind of leveraging even a sequencer design, for example, that is built to support a generalizable kind of chain, right? Like optimism or arbitrum, right? Why am I doing that? Why am I not optimizing the way in which this chain works for my specific use case? And essentially what we're doing with Reya is we're taking the very first step towards that, where in the short term, we're leveraging the Polygon CDK. So the tech stack which we're using is Polygon ZK VM. And what we've done is we've deliberately embedded into the network design itself a lot of the financial logic that is needed to support trading. So this is kind of at its core things like the margin engine itself, right, which defines your margin requirements as a trader. It deals with sentiment, it kind of does all your P&L kind of attribution. It deals with liquidation events, it deals with auto exchange events because you can hold multiple collateral assets in there. We also have built into that a passive LP pool, which is super cool. So the actual network itself, you can effectively deposit liquidity into the network, and then that will boost the liquidity of any exchange built on the network. And then within that as well, we've got kind of other cool innovations which are coming in over time, such as a yield-bearing stablecoin, which is used for settlement purposes. So what Reya Network is already is what we describe as a trading optimized L2. But what it also provides the opportunity to do over time is it provides the opportunity to keep optimizing it for our specific use case, because it's no longer needed to be some sort of generalizable kind of network. It's specifically designed for trading.
That's a really good point, and I totally space that idea that like most people aren't going to even understand. Like it would seem like a foreign concept to have a really specialized L2 like this without maybe understanding the context of, for one, you're building on Polygon, and so Polygon over this next year has this whole thing with their interop layer and like unified liquidity, so that when you're plugged into the Polygon ecosystem, once it's like fully live, which is supposed to happen before the end of 2024, it'll mean essentially like moving between chains in the Polygon ecosystem will be pretty seamless. Like it'll take seconds. It should get abstracted away and you won't even really know there's like multiple chains. And so a way, in my mind, the way I was thinking of Reya is you guys are kind of like the Osmosis, if anyone's familiar with Osmosis, in the Cosmos ecosystem, but for Polygon and without all the frictions of like bridging. And so you're like, and actually the way I found you initially was I was asking Mark from Polygon, I was saying, well, okay, who's building for this unified ecosystem with tons of different blockchains? Because that's who I want to pay attention to right now, because they're building for concepts most people can't even imagine right now, which is this idea that like moving between blockchains will be seamless. And you could have at the center of this, like this sort of exactly what you're describing, sort of like this DEX experience where all the liquidity sits and all the orders flow through. Like somebody will be the core of that for sure. In my mind, there's going to be somebody. And it sounds like that's what you're building. Is that a good way to describe it?
It is 100%. And the journey to get there is actually kind of funny. So we had this vision, like kind of for Reya, just more generally, and for Reya Network, where we wanted other exchanges to be able to come in and build on the network, and it then becomes this kind of central liquidity hub for all of these exchanges built on top of it. As we're going through the process of thinking, well, like how are we going to build this, right? Like what tech, what pieces do we need to figure out right now versus what pieces can we leverage from like other teams? We obviously reached out to a bunch of kind of teams who are building L2s. Very quickly, you narrow that down to basically two options. But what we loved about what Polygon are doing is it not only enables kind of composability in the vertical sense, where actually what's cool is people can build their own chain on top of Reya Network as an L3 because of the recursive nature of ZK proofs. But actually, what I loved when we started talking to them is this concept of an interop layer where actually they can have all of these other chains operating as L2s. And again, because of the recursive nature of ZK proofs, and we all basically send proofs to the interop layer, it enables these chains to start talking to each other. So like our vision of creating this kind of central liquidity hub, which is Reya Network for all these exchanges, all of a sudden it stops just being for people that build on Reya Network, but also started to be people that build on the Polygon interop layer, and we suddenly kind of can support what they're doing via this horizontal scaling.
And again, because this is such a new concept and most people like don't comprehend, I guess, what hasn't come yet, a good way to describe it would be like somebody on the new OKX's X1 exchange. They might want to do a swap, or maybe they want to do like a perps trade, right? Well, they put in, there's a new perps app. It's built on X1, say, and so they do this perps swap. But on the back end, it uses Reya, a completely different chain, to execute everything. But for the user, they've never left X1. They're still just clicking buttons on X1. They didn't have to bridge over funds. But on the back end, all the orders and everything's being processed through Reya. That's what's possible with this Polygon ecosystem. Or somebody on Polygon ZK EVM could do a swap. Same kind of thing. They could do a swap where they want to buy an asset on X1 that doesn't exist on ZK EVM, or maybe they're just trying to find the cheapest price for an asset. And so it could look across all these different chains. It could plug into Reya, and Reya is kind of the hub where it's like pulling through, liquidity or maybe optimizing this trade. And then it's snagging, maybe doing a trade on X1, and then a little piece over here on Polygon ZK EVM, and then a little bit from Reya, and all that kind of bundles together and settles down on the original chain the user was on. It's like you have all these weird composability options that you would never have before. It's like the internet. Like it just feels like it's connecting to different websites versus, this 15 to 20 minute bridging process and all these fees, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, if I go back to the point I was making before, to begin with, you end up with 1,000 L2s. Everyone's going to be like, well, this is just weird, right? You've lost composability. And then you realize, actually, there's this other infrastructure that's being built that's actually enabling interoperability across these chains. And then all of a sudden it starts to make sense, because you can have these chains which are optimized for their use case, but they're still able to have composability with all these other kind of products in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's kind of like back in the day when all networks were siloed and somebody's like, in the future, we want to build thousands of networks. And some guy would be like, what? Like, how are you going to, that's going to be so confusing to try to move that data between those networks. Like, are you going to hire someone to take a hard drive between these networks, or how's that going to work? It doesn't make sense. And you're like, no, you don't understand. It's going to take seconds to move between these networks. They're going to be called websites. It's going to be amazing. And back then somebody might not comprehend it, but that's essentially the vision for what you're building. And you want to be kind of the Google of these websites, only instead of data, it's like the trading engine. You're like the Google trading engine of the whole internet of all these protocols.
Exactly, the trading engine in liquidity hub, right? It's just a central hub of liquidity which can support trading on kind of multiple different venues.
You mentioned a stablecoin, and that you guys are building. Do you want to go into more details on that?
We can do this. This is one of the only pieces that we have not released more information on at this point in time, but no, at its core, so again, coming back to the ability to compose all these different kind of protocols together into the network. What we spent a lot of time deliberately doing is thinking, how is this thing going to work as one holistic being? And just even one kind of straightforward example of that is if you're bridging a whole bunch of different assets from different chains, you're at risk of having these weird inventory issues at the point that you have settlement. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of basically find a way to go, okay, we've got all of these different stable coins. You might have USDC .E coming from Arbitrum, you might have USDC coming from Ethereum. Actually, how can we create kind of a single stable coin asset which can facilitate settlement across all of the markets that are being traded on Reya Network? And that was the genesis behind coming up with a stablecoin mechanism. But what we wanted to deliberately do is take that even further and embed yield into the stablecoin itself. And there's multiple ways which we're going to do that. Just candidly, that's the only thing which we haven't released information on yet. So we're going to be putting out a blog post at some point pretty soon around it.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about the stablecoin and that kind of mechanic, especially being so central, again, My vision is that you will have thousands or millions of chains in this kind of ecosystem, and they're going to all kind of settle at some sort of central layer where like everything passes through. And I'm for like trading and different things like that. And I could picture something like Reya being that. I wanted to talk more about like some of the efficiencies that you've built into Reya, with it being like cheap, fast, efficient, and just, I don't know how that compares to things like DYDX, or how that compares to things like GMX or Binance. Can you maybe go into that?
Yes, it's kind of like, it's kind of interesting because, fundamentally, what is it that we're providing to users? We're providing them with the trading experience. So there are, of course, other places which people can go to trade, and there's kind of competitors that we have in different dimensions. So you mentioned Binance as an example, right? Like, so one of the dimensions which we're deliberately making sure that we're better than them on is on the kind of speed and throughput of the off-chain order book, right? So deliberately better than Binance. So on that dimension, you start to tick that box. There's multiple boxes that you need to tick in order to start bringing users across from somewhere like Binance, and typically they'll start kind of trading on 2 venues to begin with. So there's other things we have to do there, but like on that as an example, we're deliberately ticking the boxes there. In terms of what we've built into the kind of network, and one of the things which is super cool at the point that you start just committing to building something which is application specific, is we're able to both optimize the chain, and we're both able to optimize more within the actual kind of like trading mechanism and margin calculations that exist embedded into the network itself. So simple things like on the chain, gasless experience, just really simple thing. Gas is a terrible UX for anybody that's actually kind of like trading, right? Like, you can't just have a situation where all of a sudden there's some like random NFT project and like the cost of unwinding your trade has just spiked massively. So we've removed that from the equation. It's just automatically a gasless chain. There's other things which we can do around kind of actually the block size and the speed at which different blocks are created in order to further improve the throughput of the entire system, right? And you can't do that until you start owning the entire chain. And then there's stuff that we've built into the actual financial logic itself as well, where one of the things which we've done is we've created a margin engine which is orders of magnitude more capital efficient than other designs. And one of the main drivers of this, and actually we've kind of run some numbers on it, and we released a blog post pretty recently kind of showing the numbers around this, where it's around 350% more capital efficient for ETH BTC trading. And that's because most margin engines, if you were to go long ETH and short BTC, it would add those two margin requirements together. Whereas what we've built into kind of the Reya margin engine is we've built in the ability to recognize if one of those positions is a partial hedge for the other. Right? So if you go long ETH and short BTC, they're so highly correlated that you don't need two margin requirements that are added together. You can actually recognize one as a partial hedge of the other, and it reduces your margin requirements. So overall, again, it makes your trading experience more capital efficient, which basically means you can kind of trade higher position or more notional with the same amount of capital.
So you mentioned gasless. When you say gasless, are you guys paying for the gas essentially and then working it into fees so a user doesn't have to have a gas token? Is that what you mean? Or like there is literally no gas cost?
So as a user, you don't pay gas. Yeah. So the way in which that is ultimately subsidized by the network is the fact that the network collects trading fees, but the trading fees are constant. So you don't end up with this kind of like variable dimension to your fees whilst you're trading. Instead, it's just a constant fee. Network collects the fees and then it posts the proofs both to the Validium chain and also ultimately to Ethereum.
That's pretty crazy if you think about it, especially with like MetaMask. Like I think of the onboarding process. So Binance, you have to get signed up, you got to do your KYC, you got to fill out all this information, then you got to fund your account through your bank. It's going to take a week or whatever. It takes a while. Versus, say on Reya Network, you open up a wallet, you fund your account directly in your wallet, and you're ready to go. Boom. And then you can start trading at the same level of an experience that you'd get on Binance. Like that's actually pretty crazy. We're getting to the point that crypto UI UX used to be a hurdle, and now it's almost becoming an advantage at this point with efficiencies like this.
Yeah, same kind of, you say same experience as Binance, but with the massive difference that you're not having some centralized entity custody all of your assets. It's self-custodial, right?
Yeah.
So one of the lines I've always used in the past, if FTX was built on Reya network, it would never have blown up because it would have been completely impossible. Like they couldn't have done the stuff which they did if you had a bunch of kind of immutable smart contracts which are supporting the margin of your traders and the system.
Yeah, that's a common. I'm just going to explain this because some people that we always forget in crypto, we think everyone knows everything, and we forget this. A lot of people, actually, most people don't know most of these things that we take for granted. And one of those things is that, that crypto is actually really transparent. It's really easy to see these things on the back end and know the balance, that's held in Aave or the balance that's held on Uniswap. And despite what people think and say all the time in the media that it's like super shady and like anonymous, that's just not true in crypto. It's the exact opposite. And so, yeah, like what you said on Reya, if FTX would have been built, it's impossible. It would have been impossible for them to do what they did because you'd been custodying your own funds. You'd been holding your own funds. So it's just a whole different world on chain, and it's so much better for the end user. I was going to mention maybe this concept of a really big advantage you have with Polygon as well is this idea of like a liquidity sink, right? Like, so you mentioned fractured liquidity earlier where, like Optimism, Arbitrum, those liquidity sources are different, right? And then even on those things like, Uniswap has their own liquidity on Arbitrum, and then like Camelot has its own liquidity, and the liquidity within liquidity is fractured. With something like Reya, if it becomes like this central sort of hub for this Polygon ecosystem, not only is the liquidity like not fractured, but because all these chains are connected together through this interop layer, like every chain that joins this kind of like confederate of Polygon chains brings all that liquidity into the ecosystem and all the efficiency that comes with that. And then, Reya has this whole new like world of liquidity to play around with to then maximize more efficiency. Kind of what you were saying off earlier, that's how it would work, right? Like the more money, the more liquidity that's there in the system, the easier it is for you to do all these trades, the cheaper all these swaps become. Is that right?
Yeah, so Reya, the more liquidity that starts to come into Reya, like just in general, the better the trading conditions for anybody that's kind of trading via that as a piece of infrastructure. And what we really see is kind of the short-term or medium-term vision as a result of existing in the Polygon kind of ecosystem is just expect Reya to become the liquidity hub for all of the trading which takes place around it. And that's not to say that there won't be other DEXs with their own liquidity, of course there will be, but what becomes really powerful is that they can actually, if they choose to, they could build kind of routers which basically tap into the liquidity available on Reya network in order to boost the liquidity that's available on their exchange. Right, at which point we really do have kind of composability around liquidity effectively.
Yeah, I guess what I mean is it's just so much different than the game we've been playing, which is you have all these little pawns everywhere of liquidity, right? They're like little tiny pawns of liquidity because that's just the nature of blockchains. Is the yield farmers just kind of go where the best yield is. And so they're just running around from blockchain to blockchain, and then within those blockchains, apps to apps. And so the liquidity is very, very fractured. And when it's so easy to move between chains, like on something like with this Polygon ecosystem, and when you have all these efficiencies with something like Reya, it just makes sense to me that you'd almost build like this moat of liquidity that it's just like it goes from a pond to a lake to almost this ocean of liquidity because at that point, it just makes sense because everyone could tap into it. It's not like you're stealing liquidity from X1 by sitting on Reya. Like they can just as easily tap into that as if it was on their own chain.
Exactly. And like if we go back to kind of all the way back, one of kind of the big problems that we actually saw across the whole ecosystem is just huge proliferation of DEXs, right? Like it's not anything new actually. If you're kind of familiar with traditional finance, there's a point where there's just regulatory change, particularly in Europe. Huge proliferation of trading venues, and everyone thought it was a good thing. And then they realized that liquidity was fragmented, and actually, as soon as liquidity fragmented, actually that's a really bad thing for trading experience. And the same thing's happened in DeFi for the past few years. Just like thousands of DEXs, to the point that I can't even keep up with how many there are. And one of the things we really wanted to solve with Reya is we kind of wanted to be able to create this central liquidity hub where people could still build their own exchanges on top of the liquidity hub. Right, so they can still kind of innovate from that perspective. They could build better matching engines. They could build better interfaces. They could kind of build a new AMM invariant as an example. But they're able to tap into this liquidity hub. And when we got talking to the Polygon team, that's the point where it's like just people saying the same thing, right? And it just really started to align. Where we'd been out kind of with this vision of Reya and how we wanted that to become like the liquidity network with all these exchanges operating on top of it, actually, when we started to learn more about kind of what they're doing with the CDK, but also specifically the interop layer, and I think the key thing there in my mind is, obviously Optimism has kind of this vision for the super chain. We spoke to them too. That honestly, they're really good guys that like really want that to succeed. One of the things which was clearer to me at least was with Polygon, because it's using ZK proofs, which is kind of recursive in nature. Even though all of the way in which the interop layer is like, it's not 100% clear how that's going to work conceptually, because of the nature, the way in which ZK proofs work, and because of the recursive nature around that. Conceptually, you could see, actually, hold on a minute, I can suddenly see how this could work, right? Like, all the details aren't out, and it's going to take a while. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of things which we have to work through, but conceptually, I can see how it works. And what that meant for us as a team is, instead of having this situation where we have kind of Reya network and lots of exchanges only building on Reya network in order for Reya network to be the liquidity hub, actually what then started to be super cool is, because of this interop layer created by Polygon, we get this like horizontal scaling where any of the other chains that are integrated into the interop layer, they can actually also access the liquidity available on Reya network. So it's not just people building directly on the network, it's actually just people building on Polygon's interop layer, which all of a sudden get access to liquidity. And that for us was super cool. And like I said, it was just minds aligned. We wanted to kind of commit to that. The Polygon team have, since we kind of made that decision, been an incredible team, been supporting us kind of on a kind of journey towards launch so far. Right, we're going to be launching later this quarter. There's we are literally going to be one of the very first teams which is ever using this kind of piece of infrastructure created by Polygon. So it's going to be very, very early from that perspective, but we're super excited about what it's going to enable in the future too.
Do you know any stats about like on-chain perps and this kind of maybe more professional trading scene? Do you know any like the stats on like how much is being traded, or like the sort of revenues these things are generating?
Well, this is DeFi at the moment is 1% of, like, in what sense? So DeFi at the moment is only 1% of all of global derivative volume, perp volume. So 99% still exists in centralized entities. It's absolutely mental, right? Like, so, but and yeah, like, you asking me specifically if I know the amount of revenue which all of those exchanges generate?
No, exactly what you just said. That's great. 1% is only 1%. I didn't know that. That's so everyone else is just doing it. That includes like maybe traditional TradFi products as well?
No. So this is just taking perps, crypto perps. 99% of all volume goes through CeFi entities.
Really?
Only 1% goes through DEXs.
That's crazy, because like DYDX and GMX and all these things, they do so much. I mean, at least for me, I'm like, man, these guys are printing money with these things, but that's only 1%.
So we just honestly, we've got ambitions to be bigger than DYDX by the end of the year.
Wow.
But it would still be less than 1% of all global volume, right? Which is insane when you think about it. So centralized entities still just, and you come back to the whole CDFI point, centralized entities still just dominate volume, which is for a whole bunch of reasons, right? And what we're deliberately doing by having the C part of CDFI is that it provides a path through which we can genuinely start competing with them, right? And actually bring all of that volume on chain, right? So that people actually start to benefit from kind of all of the benefits associated with being on chain around transparency, kind of self-custodial ownership, obviously composability. And when we get that flywheel going, and you combine that with all the things we've been talking about with the liquidity hub and interop layer, right, you can really start to see how this kind of flywheel is going to start to take place.
I can, because especially considering back in 2021, 2020, it was definitely more clunky to do something like this on chain than it was off chain, like no doubt in my mind. And slowly, little pieces have been fixed. Like wallet's been getting better. I love Rabby Wallet. I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's like so easy to use. It boggles my mind why anyone would use MetaMask anymore. And then you've had like improvements in maybe costs, speed. A lot of these different chains are faster, cheaper, whatever. And now you have all these improvements coming with Reya that you're talking about. Then you couple all these things together: the lack of bridging, the gasless transactions, abundant liquidity, purpose-built chain for these things, easy to use wallets, easy to use onboarding, really easy to understand transactions that are human readable. Suddenly, it feels like to me like over the next 12 months, or maybe it's already here, it's actually easier, or at least at par, to do these things on chain than it is for, like, I would never want to trade on, like, even good exchanges like Kraken, Coinbase. Like, to me, that feels clunky to have to, like, go put my money in there and go use it. It's actually easier for me to do things on chain, and it's only going to get easier over the next 12 months.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is the thing, like, I don't actually, the Coinbase, Kraken, right, like, scaling technology, the types of things we're talking about right now, they're emerging right now. So they're enabling this type of product to exist right now, and it makes sense that they built their kind of exchanges the way that they built them back in, when they first launched, because this type of infrastructure wasn't available. Like what we have, which is unbelievably kind of unique from a timing perspective, is that we're positioning ourselves kind of right at this inflection point where all of these things are coming together at the exact same time, which are going to suddenly enable us to build exchanges and products which are actually initially at feature parity with CeFi, and then very, very quickly start to surpass them because you get all of the benefits associated with being on chain. And there's one thing which I kind of love saying around this is Larry Fink came out the other day and he's like, I want to tokenize the world. Yeah. Right, it's great. But the question you've got to ask is, where the fuck is he going to trade that? Because if he takes all of these assets, which is now tokenized, and he tries to trade them on a CeFi entity, it's completely pointless tokenizing it. There's just no benefit associated with that at all. So if you actually want to reap the benefits associated with tokenization, you need to be able to trade that on an exchange that is underpinned by blockchain-based rails. Right? And that is the vision that Reya is building into, where we ultimately want to become the entry point for all of the world's assets which are being tokenized to be able to be traded on chain.
So maybe the ultimate, grandest, biggest vision for Reya is the global stock market for the entire planet.
Yeah, yeah. So there's, just in the most extreme. So I think if I talk about kind of 1, 3, 5 years, sometimes I don't know, people love asking that for some reason. 1 year, end of first year, we want to be bigger than DYDX. Like, I'm completely open about that. And I think we've got a really good shot at doing it. 3 years, we want to be bigger than Binance. This is the bull case, right? As everybody starts realizing, actually, hold on, why am I trading this on the centralized exchange when the experience is better doing it on chain? And then 5 years from now, we want Larry Fink to tokenize everything, and we want all of these assets to be traded via kind of Reya network.
Man, I love people that dream big, bold visions because they're the most likely to achieve those visions. And it kind of reminds me, we were talking earlier about, CeFi exchanges or traditional exchanges versus, something like Reya. It reminds me of the early days of the internet where maybe a user was like, I don't want to buy something online. It's so inconvenient. I'd rather just go to the store. You have to do shipping. You have to boot up your modem. That's so clunky. And then slowly over time, it got to the point where it was on par with maybe going to something in the store. And then it just became far easier. It's just so easy to pull out your phone, boom, boom, order everything you want, order your groceries, order your, new products from Amazon or whatever. And it's seamless and easy. And we're getting to that point, that inflection point for crypto, for these derivatives trades and for swapping and trading in general. I think in 2024, we're at the point where boom, it is now easier to do these things on chain than it is to do these things off chain.
Yeah. No, I think next 12 to 18 months, we are, like I said, we're at this really unique point in time where all of these different kind of emerging technologies are coming live at the exact same time, which will create this inflection point where we'll go from being worse than CeFi to very, very quickly being better than CeFi. At which point, I expect all of the volume to migrate and start trading through venues that exist on chain.
What do you think is going to give you the edge versus someone like DYDX? What are you building to say, hey, this is how we're going to beat DYDX?
Yeah, so DYDX is just strategy is commendable. They basically want to try and build the most decentralized trading venue in the world, right? But what that actually involves is it involves a block building process in the way in which orders are kind of matched, right? You basically have all these different order books which are maintained on these different nodes. They all have to whisper to each other. That then kind of creates blocks at the point where you have matched trades. Kind of long story short, you add latency to the system, right? So you're adding latency. So by definition, you are creating a worse trading experience. In order to optimize for decentralization, you're creating a worse trading experience than you get on a centralized entity. Do I want to try and optimize for decentralization? Yes, of course, but I also want to optimize for bringing all of this volume off these CeFi entities and bringing it on chain. So in order to do that, you kind of have to accept, I can't have a block building process in my order matching engine, right? Like I have to have that off chain in order to be able to compete with these CeFi entities. So that's where we deliberately separated the kind of like off-chain versus on-chain piece so that we can compete with CeFi and start bringing this stuff on-chain.
This reminds me a lot of like maybe like on-chain games. And the concept of like I'm sufficiently decentralized. If you think of a video game, there's like a lot with a game you do not need to on-chain. You don't need like the entire game on-chain when you're playing it. Like those are interesting and those are going to be unique games for sure. But in reality, when it comes to like crypto gaming, the assets are really what you need on chain. Like those assets and your ability to own them for 99% of use cases for what makes crypto gaming really cool and unique. That's all you need, not the entire game on chain. And then at that point, you're sufficiently decentralized. It makes sense. It's overkill to do all of it on chain. And so what you're kind of describing is with Reya is, hey, we have all the really important things. That's all on chain. It's this other thing that's not like this is not a critical part of like what's needed to be on chain, but this does, if you take it off chain, allow things to go so much better, be so much more seamless. And now, boom, we're doing the same kind of things that Binance and Coinbase and Kraken can do by just taking this one piece off chain. What are the weird things you could do with an order book off chain? What are like the worst case scenarios?
Well, the way in which it actually works is that you basically you to kind of dumb it down, you basically sign dumb it down is the wrong language. To try and explain it in really simple terms. If someone wants to enter a trade, they will effectively sign a proportion of a transaction with their wallet, right? That will then enable them to put an order into the order book. If it matches in the price range which they're wanting to match, when it comes to go on chain, it will match the other side of this transaction and just basically say, I can confirm that this person wants to trade at this price, right? And then that will enable the actual execution of that trade to go through. So what does that actually mean? It means that you are delivering this really high throughput, low latency trading matching engine off chain, but the trade is never going to actually propagate on chain and settle unless it's doing that within the price bands at which the person is wanting to trade at. Does that make sense? So you kind of have these controls around it anyway. Does
that does make sense. It's sort of vaguely like off-chain intent or like, intent-based trading.
A little.
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
But let's say Simon, in 2 years, you like become like the super villain and you're like, I will take I'm going to wreak as much possible havoc using this order book as possible. What is the worst damage you could do? I guess that's the concept I'm trying to understand.
This is like, so if people aren't putting trades through it, then nothing, right? Like there's just, so all of the assets, like all of the assets exist on chain and are held in smart contracts on chain, on Reya network. Like all of your collateral, like is on chain. All of the settlement, all of the logic that exists around that, like just pretty much every single thing except the matching of trades is on chain. So if you're not putting trades through and trying to match at a stupid price, right, like there's just nothing. Like the worst thing that I could do is just switch it off. So you want to trade, and just for whatever reason we just switched off the order book, right? Like that's the worst case scenario.
And when you say switch off, it's not like I would lose access to my funds. It's just like now I could not click the button to do the trade. It might still have my funds. It's not like you took anything away from me. You took like.
Your funds are still on chain. I mean, just to be clear, that's never like. It's never going to happen anyway, but like your funds are all on chain. No one can touch your funds except for you. The worst thing that could happen is that just the order book went offline for whatever reason.
Well, maybe you kind of already answered this, but what are some things Reya will be able to do, maybe as the blockchain as a whole, that are unique to Reya?
So I guess there's a bunch of different things, right? Like the C DeFi on its own, I think, is a kind of strategy and as a commitment to trying to take a lot of the volume away from the centralized entities, that is fundamentally unique. And when we kind of talk about this vision of the future where like all assets in the world are tokenized, like it is very clear how products like Reya need to exist in order for that vision of the future to become a reality. Right? Like you need a venue through which you can actually trade a tokenized asset directly on blockchain-based rails. So that on its own, I think, is fundamentally unique. The other stuff, of course, is everything that's built into the network itself, right? Where we've deliberately optimized the chain, and we will continue to optimize the chain kind of and the sequencer itself over time to support the kind of specific use case of trading, right? So why do we have a generalizable sequencer? Right, at the moment we're using Polygon zkEVM. In the future, we'll probably make adaptations to that to continue to improve throughput. We can put application-specific logic, like stuff around liquidations. We can put that into the sequencer itself so we can keep improving the trading experience for anybody on the network. And then the other thing, of course, is the financial logic, which is currently there, and in particular, the margin engine logic and the passive LP logic, which enables this liquidity hub to start to be created, which can be used by all these other exchanges, either building directly on Reya network or kind of horizontally via the interop layer.
So you guys, I was reading through like a blog post or something, and you guys mentioned the Reya token. How will that function in the ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we've deliberately done is we spent lots of time thinking about the system as a whole, right? And one of the things we're really keen to make sure is that the Reya token can be used as a form of utility within the actual kind of network design. So in its simplest form, one of the things that you'll be able to do is you'll be able to stake it in order to receive a proportion of the fees which are being generated by the actual network itself. But then alongside that, there's a whole bunch of other interesting things which we can start to build into it as a result of having this interconnected kind of set of kind of financial primitives that are supporting trading. And there's a bunch of stuff which we haven't announced around that, but we will kind of be announcing that in due course.
Any idea on maybe you can't say this, but any idea on when that token's coming?
I think it's highly likely to take place later this year.
Later this year. Okay. If it was around right now, I'd be like, boom, I'm grabbing that right now.
Yeah, it doesn't really work when it's like so early in the year. But no, there's we kind of want Reya to be as decentralized as it possibly can be, and obviously having the token live is really important to enabling that kind of vision to exist.
Right now, the crypto space reminds me a lot of well, okay, if you go back to like 2017, I remember like the crypto space was essentially people would launch white papers and cool websites, and they would have a really cool name for their ticker. And that was like what made a project good or not. And there were so many projects that we're going to solve this really abstract thing that nobody understands. And people were like, oh, that sounds super sci-fi. They'd buy the token, it would skyrocket, and it was amazing. Like almost everything was essentially a meme coin back in 2017 with very few actual good things, because nobody was doing things on chain essentially. Then we go to 2021. Now people are doing things on chain, and we actually have some good products, but they're kind of like the alpha version of these products. So you have builders actually building things, but they're kind of like the first batch of things. So the AOLs, all the for like Ask Jeeves search engines and that kind of stuff. And then now fast forward to this cycle, it finally feels like we have like the batch of builders building things that are going to change the world. And that's what Reya feels like to me. Like, I don't know if you'll succeed or if you won't succeed, but what you're building feels like it could change the world. It could be the global stock market of the future. It feels like we have the Googles, the Amazons, these big companies they're going to grow to be massive in the future. Those are the builders building right now, and this kind of third wave is what it feels like. And it's just so cool to kind of be in the space. And it's so exciting because you're not the only person I've talked to where I'm like, this is crazy. There's so many cool things being built this cycle that like would have blown everything out of the water just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly our like vision for we kind of, like I said, we originally, the team behind Volt's protocol, we decided to sunset that and actually kind of focus entirely on Reya because, frankly, as a team and for me personally, I want to spend time building products that do change the world. And Reya's got a genuine shot at being able to do that, which is why it's so exciting.
Yeah, it does. What other projects maybe in the Polygon ecosystem or just in the space as a whole are like exciting to you, or catching your attention?
Yeah, there's the challenge is there's a lot of the infrastructure that I find really interesting, right? there's a bunch of I mean, we kind of have our competitors that we spend a lot of. Honestly, when you're really deep in the weeds, you spend the majority of the time focusing on what you're building, and then I spend a lot of time looking at infrastructure just because I find it kind of interesting in terms of what it unlocks for the overall ecosystem. Obviously, Eigen is one that's right up there at the moment. It's getting a lot of attention. I agree with it, just what it's worth as a principle, right? Like if you have these 1,000 different L2s, right, you don't want the kind of attack vector to be the fact that that L2 is supported by a relatively low cap kind of token, right? Like, so if you can actually have it backed by every ETH staker and you essentially have this 400 billion like insurance that exists behind it, right? That enables the vision for L2s to exist. So I spend a lot of time looking at infrastructure. I like that as an example. I obviously really like what Polygon are doing with the aggregation layer, which is why there's been so much alignment from that perspective. And then the truth is we spend time looking at competitors, trying to get ideas, but we honestly don't spend too much time doing that. It's more kind of focused on yourself.
That makes sense. Is there anything that we haven't touched on or covered? Because I mean, this is kind of my first exposure to Reya, so I know there's a lot that I don't know. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should be talking about right now?
I think maybe the only thing I'd talk about is launch timelines, right? Like, so we announced Reya in December last year, so just before Christmas. We've been working on it for a few months actually, and what that means is it means that we're on track to go live this quarter. Now, to begin with, that will be without the order book. So anybody trading via Reya Exchange will be trading against the passive LP pool, right? In the same way that anybody else can plug into that passive LP pool, and the order book will come kind of later in either Q2 or Q3. But yeah, no, like launches soon, right? Like we're talking weeks away, so we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I'd be pretty excited about that too, because that's when things really get going. It's I feel like anyone when you're launching a business, you're launching a brand, anything, like the conceptualization of it versus like when the rubber meets the road and things actually go live, it's just like that's when things really start getting, being built and functioning and moving forward, because you have live feedback constantly happening and you're motivated because it's live. You can't mess up now.
Yeah, and proving some of the. I mean, so like I said, we're kind of very focused on being a vertically integrated exchange to begin with, but even proving some of the stuff with Polygon via the aggregation layer. Like as soon as we go live, we want to do that, and we want to actually show people. It's kind of like, look, this is how it works, right? Like we know that this is possible because we've been building it, right? But now you can actually see it, and you can see it working in practice, like being able to do that in a practical level rather than a theoretical level is obviously super exciting.
Yeah, because they have the phase one of that kind of ag layer is going live, I think, in the first half of the year, and then like the full blown interop layer where everything's unified, that goes. I think Mark said by the end of the year they're going to have that live.
Yeah, so the kind of like first version enables us to do a few things which we kind of want to prove, and then like they've given us some timelines. Just the engineering timelines are obviously subject to being pushed out, so I think by the end of the year is a realistic timeline based on what I know. But
that's so exciting. I feel like that, and then when they switch to the poll token, that's going to bring a lot of attention to Polygon, just because for some reason everyone's speculating in the space. They just like the new tokens. They're weird. They completely disown all the old projects, and they're like, oh, this new project, this looks really interesting. Everyone's just kind of playing games in the space, but this will kind of feed into that. So when Matic becomes Pol, suddenly everyone's gonna be like, oh, it's a new token. They're gonna take notice of that. They're gonna take notice of the Polygon ecosystem, and they're gonna take notice of all these different Polygon projects. So I think for probably your whole little, for everything building in Polygon, it's gonna be kind of a good thing when that happens.
Yeah. But I mean, like, just for anybody, kind of those things obviously help with growth, and we're kind of excited about that when they actually make the switch. For anyone who interacts with Reya kind of directly, there's a lot of the complexity around like what chain are you on. Like no one's going to really know this on Polygon's EKVM because all of that's abstracted away. It just feels like it's very clear that you're interacting with something which is blockchain based, right, and that therefore it is self-custodial. But the user experience is a lot more akin to CeFi, right? And even if you're bridging from all these different chains, make the bridging experience really simple. So it doesn't make any difference really whether that was on Arbitrum, on OP Stack, on kind of Polygon's EKVM. from a UX perspective, in terms of what it enables, in terms of features we can build in the future, it's a huge difference that it's on Polygon's EKVM. But from a user experience, in terms of that interaction, it's going to feel like interacting with a CeFi exchange.
What's the easiest way if people kind of want to follow along, stay up to date, to kind of keep up to date with what Reya is doing?
Yeah, so you should follow us on Twitter. So we're Reya_XYZ is our Twitter handle. And then from there, you can actually also navigate to the Discord. So we've got super active communities, like 20,000 people, all really excited about the project going live. If you're in there, you've got questions, like either me or someone in the team is going to reply pretty quickly. And we're keen to help upskill people in terms of kind of knowledge around the way in which Reya works, and either as a trader, as an LP, or actually as a builder if someone's wanting to build on the network in the future.
Awesome. And I don't really think we talked about any specific tokens besides Polygon, but as always, no, this was investment advice. As far as Polygon goes, I'm a holder of Matic, and I think that's all the disclosures I got to make. It's been great talking with you, Simon, and I'm really excited for Reya. I'm excited for you guys to launch, and yeah, I can't wait.